Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Neighbors Interfaith Talk series. This is a very special day for the Arabic Studies program because Professor Brian Leopard is with us today. I'm Abla Hassan. I teach Arabic language and culture for Nebraska University, and I'm the coordinator of the Arabic Studies program. I'm so grateful to all those who made this happen. I'm so grateful to our co-sponsors, Department of Modern Languages and Literature here at UNL, Classics and Religious Studies, the Honors Program, and the Digital Islamic Studies a program housed at Michigan University. I'm very grateful to the personal help and support as well from the program coordinator from Evan Murphy. And today we're meeting with Professor Brian Leopard to learn about the Baha'i Faith. Welcome to the Arabic Studies program. And let me start by introducing our big guest. A quick note, I'm going to be recording the conversation itself, but then we will pause the recording for your questions. Professor Brian Leopard is a Harold W. Conroy Distinguished Professor of Law and Director of LLM program in global legal practice. He's a leading expert in the fields of international law, human rights law, comparative law, and tax law. He has degrees from Princeton University and Yale University, and he's the author of 8 books and numerous articles. It's a great honor, Professor Brian, not only that you accepted my invitation to join us today, but also that you've joined every meeting of Neighbors, and you gave me an opportunity to brag about you and to brag about Neighbors all semester long. Like every time someone checked with me about Neighbors, I was like, are you kidding me? Professor Brian is with us every time. So thank you so much. We're meeting to learn about the Baha'i Faith, and I'm eager, as we shared in our discussion before we started recording, to know from you about the Baha'i Faith. What is the Baha'i Faith? What makes someone Baha'i? What are the core concepts? And even if you want to address misunderstandings as well.
Thank you so much. Well, yes, it's an honor to be back. And I have to say, I've really learned so much from each of these programs. And I really want to thank you for organizing them. And of course, to all the other sponsors. I'm really proud of UNL for having such a great program that's aimed at increasing interreligious understanding and knowledge and collaboration. And that's appropriate because actually that's a main theme of the Baha'i Faith, is the unity of religions and trying to promote interreligious cooperation. So I'm going to share my screen so that I can in turn share with you a slide presentation to assist us as I go ahead and introduce what everyone should know about the Baha'i Faith. So hopefully you can see that. Anyone happen to know what this building is? Or have you seen it before? No. Okay, so this is the Baha'i House of Worship. It is outside Chicago, Illinois, in the village of Wilmette on the shores of Lake Michigan. And it's actually on the National Register of Historic Places. So many, often it's on the list of sites that tourists to Chicago should visit. So many have seen it. And interestingly, this building, like all Baha'i houses of worship, has 9 sides, and those symbolize 9 religions. And we'll kind of talk later about the religions that the Baha'i Faith recognizes. But the idea is that you can reach God through any of these doors. You can reach God through any of these religions. They all lead to the beautiful skylight inside. There's a beautiful glass dome inside this temple where the sun shines in. So that's symbolic of being able to approach God from any of the world's great faiths. So again, that's a symbol of this idea of unity. And also the 9 sides symbolize unity in a different way because 9 is the largest single digit number. So that is also a symbol of unity in the Baha'i Faith. So at any rate, I am happy to share with you some basic information. Maybe it's not everything should know, but at least it's some of the basics. So again, I thought I'd begin with this quote from one of the two prophet founders of the Baha'i Faith, Baha'u'llah, which is very much in support of the spirit of our Neighbors program, right? Consort with the followers of all religions in a spirit of friendliness and fellowship. Baha'u'llah counsels us. And so that is the main theme of the Baha'i Faith. And I was raised as a Baha'i. My parents came from different religious backgrounds. My dad had been raised as a Methodist in Western Nebraska in the town of Alliance, where he first heard about the Baha'i Faith in his Sunday school class in the 1940s in Alliance, Nebraska, if you can imagine. But he had a Sunday school teacher who was very open-minded, wanted to introduce the students to other religions. And apparently one of his classmates said, "Oh, I have an aunt in Omaha who's a member of a really funny sounding religion." So she called up her aunt, they did have telephones then, and was able to share a little bit of information about the Baha'i Faith. And then what's kind of funny is my dad's best friend from Alliance, Nebraska, went on to study at Oxford, became a Rhodes Scholar. He eventually became a Baha'i, then said to my dad, "Hey, you really have to investigate this religion." And then my dad went to Northwestern, which was right next door to the Baha'i House of Worship we just saw, and literally got to go to the dedication in 1953. But eventually my dad met my mom, and my mom came from a Jewish background. And they started investigating the Baha'i Faith together again, and were really attracted to this teaching of unity of religions. And then they became Baha'is just a year before I was born. But in my heart, this was always the teaching of Baha'u'llah that I felt closest to. And then eventually got to write about unity of religions from more of a legal and ethical standpoint, but I have focused on looking at common ethical principles in the world's great religions as part of my books and in the courses that I teach. So anyway, more about that later if you're interested. But I guess like a good professor, I have to lay out the goals of today's discussion. So I hope that you'll acquire a basic familiarity with the history of the Baha'i Faith and the lives of its central figures, the Bab and Baha'u'llah, who are the twin prophets of the Baha'i Faith, and then Abdul-Baha, who's the oldest son of Baha'u'llah. I'd also like to share some information about the close relationship of the Baha'i Faith with other religions. Baha'is really view the Baha'i Faith as a continuation of other religions, not as a separate religion. And we'll talk about some of those links later. Obviously, you'll get to learn a little bit about the basic teachings of the Baha'i Faith, and finally, about the diversity and global reach of the Baha'i community today. So just a few basic facts. The Baha'i Faith is an independent world religion. Speaking of misconceptions, sometimes it's inaccurately described as a sect of Islam, but it's not. So even though Baha'u'llah and the Bab were obviously born as Muslims, they did declare that they were the bearers of a new revelation from God. And so it is an independent religion in that sense. And so it was founded in 1844 in Persia, which today is known as Iran. Today, there are about 5 million Baha'is in the world. And interestingly, they're very spread out around the world, many different countries. And in fact, according to statistics in the World Christian Encyclopedia, as well as I think Encyclopedia Britannica, if you ranked religions by how many different countries their members reside in, the Baha'i Faith would be second, next to Christianity. Sounds like my dog needs to get out, so give me one moment. Okay, well, that's life with COVID and Zoom, huh? I like to joke my dog is my teaching assistant, yes, every semester. So I suspect he heard somebody joining us and he heard the bell ring on Zoom and he thought that was the doorbell, so he had to go. Anyway, here we are. So where were we at? Yeah, so I was just talking about the diversity of the Baha'i community. So really Baha'is come from all different races, ethnic groups, nationalities, and even religious backgrounds. So it's not an ethnicity, it's not a, obviously a lot of people meet Baha'is who are from Iran. So, but actually, most Baha'is, of course, are not from Iran. In fact, the largest Baha'i community is in India. And here in the United States, Baha'is come from all different backgrounds. Some are refugees from Iran, but most are, however you want to call it, people who've been raised in the U.S. from different backgrounds and become Baha'is. And by the way, I should say, feel free to interject any questions along the way. I'd be happy to, but of course, I'll leave time at the end for just open discussion and questions. Yeah. So just some basic beliefs. Baha'is believe in two prophets of God. We also call them manifestations of God. They're known as the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Those are Arabic terms. So the Bab means gate, and Baha'u'llah means glory of God. And in Baha'i belief, the Bab, while an independent prophet in his own right, had the primary mission of preparing people for the coming of Baha'u'llah. So it's a little bit like the role of John the Baptist in preparing people for Christ, except that in Christian theology, John the Baptist is not considered a prophet, whereas in the Baha'i faith, the Bab and Baha'u'llah are each honored as prophets. And as we'll talk about, actually, we just commemorated the bicentenaries of their respective births in 1817 and 1819. Baha'u'llah appointed his eldest son, Abdul-Baha, as the authorized interpreter of his teachings. But Abdul-Baha is not a prophet, according to Baha'i belief. And but he is, we believe, a perfect example of how human beings should behave, but he's not a prophet. So really the central teachings of the Baha'u'llah are the unity of all members of the human family, the elimination of all forms of prejudice, and the equality of all people, including men and women. And that's why I was really interested in Dr. Hassan's book on equality of women and men in the Quran particularly, because this is a central belief of Baha'is. But really, unity is the main theme of the Baha'i faith. We believe that the main purpose of Baha'u'llah's revelation is to help unite humanity, but in a global civilization that respects diversity, and that includes diversity of religion and race and nationality and ethnicity and language, culture. So that's the challenge. How do we be united while respecting our diversity and even honoring our diversity? So here are a few quotes from Baha'u'llah about the unity of humanity. Baha'u'llah wrote, "The well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established." So this is really the fundamental goal of Baha'is, to help unify humanity, starting with their neighborhoods, their communities, on up to the entire globe. Baha'u'llah also says that at this stage in the spiritual evolution of humankind, we can now regard ourselves even as members of one country. So a famous quote from Baha'u'llah is, "The earth is but one country and mankind its citizens." Now that doesn't mean that countries are not important and that we shouldn't have a legitimate sense of patriotism, which is fine and even encouraged, but it does mean that our fundamental loyalty ought to be to the whole of the human race. So I guess I'll go on and talk about the history, but again, feel free to interject questions. It's probably easiest to raise your figurative hands. So a little bit of information about the life and writings of the Bab. So the Bab was a young man when he declared to a seeker, a religious seeker named Mullah Hussein on May 23rd, 1844 in Shiraz, Iran, that he was the promised one that many Muslims, and particularly those of the Shiite branch of Islam, were seeking. So Baha'is believe that the Bab was the spiritual return of the 12th Imam in Shia Islam, also known as the hidden Imam. The Bab's ministry lasted for 6 years. He was, of course, he quickly attracted many followers, including women. One of his first followers was a woman named Tahireh, and there are some amazing stories about the life and heroism of Tahireh, because she, of course, believed in this new teaching of the Bab of equality of women and men. And at a gathering of followers of the Bab known as Babis, she famously took off her veil as a symbol of the equality of women and men. And this was so shocking to the other Babis. I think one of them actually committed suicide because at the time this was viewed as such a terrible violation of the law for a woman to take off her veil. And ultimately she was killed for her beliefs. And in fact, the Bab himself was he was taken from prison to prison by the Shah and ultimately executed in a public square in Tabriz. And more about that in a moment. Now, theologically, interestingly, as I said, the Baha'i scriptures refer to the Bab not only as the spiritual return of the 12th Imam, but also as in effect the return of John the Baptist spiritually, in that he prepared the people for the coming of Baha'u'llah. But he is a full prophet in his own right. He wrote a holy book called the Bayan, which has all been translated to many languages. But Baha'is believe that his primary mission was to prepare for Baha'u'llah's coming. And in the language of the Bab's writings, him whom God shall make manifest. However, it was in 1844 that the Bab revealed his station as a new prophet, and that is the date that we begin the history of the Baha'i Faith. It's very interesting that in that same year, 1844, many Christians were expecting Christ to return based on various prophecies in the books of the Bible, including in the Hebrew scriptures. And in fact, the followers of William Miller particularly believed that Christ would return. There was a lot of religious fervor in the United States in that year. Many abandoned their homes as they believed that they would be raised to heaven in the great rapture. Of course, that didn't happen physically, so many were disappointed. That's often known as the Great Disappointment of 1844. But, Baha'is believe that the coming of the Bab also fulfilled prophecies in the Bible. And I'll mention that a little bit more. So what's interesting about the Baha'i Faith is there are these connections with prophecies from other faiths that also link it with other faiths, including Islam and Christianity. Now, as I mentioned, the Bab's followers were severely persecuted. The Bab himself was executed on July 9th, 1850 by a firing squad of 750 soldiers. And there's really kind of a remarkable story about how the first round of 750 soldiers firing on him failed to kill him. Their bullets merely severed his chains. And because he had said he wasn't ready yet to be executed, he was finishing some writings in his prison cell. And they actually, when the dust cleared, they found him back in his prison cell. And then he declared that he was ready to die. They actually had to assemble a whole new regiment because the leader of the first one, who was a devout Christian, said, "This is incredible. Like, this is a miracle. This must be of God, and I will not lead my soldiers to fire again." So they assembled another regiment, which did, in fact, succeed in killing him. It's a remarkable story. There were many Westerners present at this event, this execution, who were testimony to these events, including some of the Western diplomats stationed in Persia at the time. But speaking of the teachings of the Bab declared that all the prophets of God, including Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, the Bab himself, and him whom God shall make manifest, which Baha'is believe is Baha'u'llah, were all manifestations of one God. And as the Bab says, what shineth resplendent in each one of them hath been and will ever remain the one and the same sun. So this is a critical Baha'i belief, that all of God's prophets, including Muhammad and Jesus and Moses, are all like mirrors who reflect the light of God to humanity. And we can see God through them. They are all perfect mirrors. And actually, Baha'u'llah says, we cannot make, no mirror is better than the other. No prophet is better than another prophet. And of course, the Quran says something similar in terms of Muhammad saying, he also talked about all of God's prophets as being equal. The Baha'i writings also recognize Krishna and Buddha as prophets of God. So, but there's more of an emphasis on what we might call the Abrahamic prophets. So now turning to the life of Baha'u'llah, the second prophet of the Baha'i Faith. He was born in 1817 in Tehran, in Persia. So interestingly, in 2017, we commemorated the bicentenary of Baha'u'llah's birth around the world and had a special program in Lincoln. The governor issued a proclamation. And then 2 years later, in 1819, we commemorated the birth of the Bab after 200 years. And the governor also issued a proclamation in honor of the Bab. A little bit about the life of Baha'u'llah. He was actually born to a very wealthy family. His father was a government minister. He was actually offered a position in the government, but he refused. He really wanted to serve the poor and live among the poor. He was renowned for his extraordinary learning as a child. Because of his emphasis on living among and helping the poor, he became known as the father of the poor. But he was an early follower of the Bab before he proclaimed his own revelation. He was cruelly imprisoned in a terrible pit known as the Sea of Chal. It was a sewer, actually, with heavy 100-pound chain around his neck. That was known as the Black Pit. It was really the worst prison in Tehran. But it was in that prison in 1852 that he had a vision in which his mission was disclosed to him, that he was a new manifestation of God. But for 11 years, he withheld that knowledge because of the increasing persecution of the Baha'is. The Shah again was trying to really snuff out this new religion that was viewed as heretical. And so Baha'u'llah was exiled. He was sent out of Persia to Iraq, first to Baghdad. He did then spend 2 months in the mountains of Sulaymaniyah, living there and praying and fasting. Eventually his family convinced him to come back to Baghdad. Then he got another order to be exiled to Constantinople, now known as Istanbul. Again, they were trying to send him further and further away from Persia to try to reduce his influence. But before he was forced to leave Baghdad, he was allowed to pitch a tent in a garden just outside of Baghdad known as the Garden of Rizwan. And it was there in April 1863 that he announced that he was, in fact, the one promised by the Bab and a new prophet. And actually right now is our most holy festival. It's called the Festival of Rizwan, which means paradise, to commemorate Baha'u'llah's time, 12 days that he spent in that garden with his followers when he announced his mission. So we actually honor the 1st, 9th, and 12th days of Rizwan particularly. The 12th day is Saturday. We had the 9th day, I think, yesterday. So we have special holy day commemorations, but this is our most holy period of the year, is to honor Baha'u'llah's declaration. So as I said, he suffered many more exiles, first to Constantinople, then Adrianople. Finally, the authorities sent him to the worst prison in the Ottoman Empire, which was in Akka, in the Holy Land, in Palestine. And he was imprisoned there, but because, it's an interesting story, because he encouraged the Baha'is who also were sent there and were in prison to forgive their oppressors and to try to do good works for the people there in Palestine, including like trying to help build an aqueduct. Eventually he was allowed to outside of the actual prison and allowed to live on some land outside. But he was always under house arrest, in effect, for the rest of his life. But it was in Akka that he revealed his book of laws, known as the Kitab-i Aqdas, the most holy book. And that book opens with an affirmation of humanity's twin duties: to recognize God's latest prophet and to follow his laws. And of course, in Baha'i belief, that is Baha'u'llah. So, people ask, well, what's the Baha'i Bible? Well, the truth is Baha'u'llah and the Bab and Abdul-Baha wrote like hundreds of volumes. Like we have a whole bookshelf of books that are considered Baha'i scripture. But if you were to look to one book as really the central book, it would be his book of laws, the Kitab-i Aqdas. So during his exiles, Baha'u'llah wrote tablets to the kings, rulers, and religious leaders of the planet, including Queen Victoria, Napoleon. He also wrote to the Pope Pius IX, in which he proclaimed that he had come to fulfill the scriptures and help bring the kingdom of God on earth. So we do believe the Baha'i Faith fulfills many prophecies of previous religions relating to building the kingdom of God on earth. There was a Western professor, Edward Granville Brown of Cambridge University, who became really fascinated by this new religion. In fact, a lot of Westerners who learned about it became very interested in it. Just as an aside, I happened to have a job. I got a job when I was in college in Paris, working at Merck Pharmaceuticals. But it's kind of funny, like, okay, I was doing like accounting, which I knew nothing about, especially French accounting. But at least I knew debit and credit. I recognized that. But what's kind of neat is one of my office mates, was a Muslim, and interestingly, someone who was like French, who converted to Islam. But he got all excited about me being a Baha'i because of all the connections between Islam and the Baha'i faith. And like, oh, here's someone else who like believes in the Quran, and this is really neat. So, but he was like a collector of old books, and he said, oh, I have a great book I need to show you. And it was like a review, a religious scholarly review in French from Paris from like 1910 that had a whole article about the Bab and the persecution of the Babis and the whole, the Bahá'í Faith as it was known. And there was just a lot of, it was like 30-page article in this French religious studies journal from, 1910. There was just a lot of fascination with this religion that talked about uniting the religions of the world. So Professor Brown wrote about his interview with Baha'u'llah. By this time, Baha'u'llah was, under house arrest at this property outside Akka. And so these are some words he recorded of Baha'u'llah, which are very significant, where Baha'u'llah talks about the imperative of world peace. And Baha'u'llah says, these fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come. Do not you in Europe need this also? Is not this that which Christ foretold? Yet do we see your kings and rulers lavishing their treasures more freely on means for the destruction of the human race than on that which will conduce to the happiness of mankind. These strifes and this bloodshed and discord must cease, and all men be as one kindred and one family. Let not a man glory in this, that he loves his country. Let him rather glory in this, that he loves his kind. So again, really an emphasis on bringing about global peace, which is one of the another main focus of Baha'i action and teaching. So Baha'u'llah died in 1892. And in his will, he appointed his eldest son, Abdul-Baha, as his successor. By the way, Abdul-Baha means servant of Baha, like servant of the glory. And so he emphasized the station of servitude. Actually, we all should be servants of humanity, right? And interestingly, during his lifetime, Baha'u'llah had pitched his tent on Mount Carmel in Haifa in the Holy Land and identified there the spot where the remains of the Bab should eventually be interred. He designated that mountain, Mount Carmel, which is revered by both Jews and Christians, as the world center of his new faith. And so for that reason, the Baha'i World Center is in what is now Israel, but of course it long predated Israel. And that is where our international governing body sits, in a beautiful building on the slopes of Mount Carmel. So some people, even if they may not have seen the Baha'i house of worship near Chicago, but they have gone to Israel, perhaps, and seen the Baha'i shrines, because it's a major tourist stop. Like, it's one of the main tourist attractions that people would see if they visit Israel and go to Haifa. So as I've talked about before, Baha'u'llah taught that divine revelation is progressive and continuous, that God sends messengers to humanity to guide humanity and will never stop sending messengers. And he says that these messengers are manifestations of God, are the luminaries of truth, and the mirrors reflecting the light of divine unity, who have been sent by God to educate the souls of men. So again, there's that beautiful metaphor of the mirror, just like Christ is a mirror, Moses is a mirror, Muhammad is a mirror. And it's also interesting, by the way, even though these quotes refer to men, that is because it's my understanding that the original language in which he wrote, it was either Persian or Arabic, does not draw the gender distinction. So it should really be read as either gender or any gender, right? So Baha'u'llah did forthrightly announce that he was the return of Christ, as well as the comforter and spirit of truth promised in the New Testament. And he explained that in his tablet to Pope Pius IX, as well as another tablet known as the Tablet to the Christians. And he gave many proofs to support this very significant claim. I mean, if you're interested, I've written a book about the relationship between the Baha'i faith and Christianity that kind of goes through some of those prophecies in the Bible and claims. And it's called In the Glory of the Father, the Baha'i Faith and Christianity. So, but it's designed actually for Christian readers who are interested in learning about the relationships between the Baha'i faith and Christianity. Other scholars have, it's not really a scholarly book, it's written more for what you just might call the layperson, whatever. That sounds, doesn't sound quite right, but the non-scholars. But there are other books that explore in detail the relationship between the Baha'i faith and Islam, many books, as well as, there's a book on Baha'i faith and Buddhism, Baha'i faith and Hinduism. It's really kind of interesting. So Baha'u'llah renewed the essential spiritual teachings of the Hebrew scriptures, the New Testament, the Quran, and other holy scriptures. These include, for example, the Golden Rule, the commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves. But at the same time, he brought, like as we believe all of God's manifestations, new social laws adapted to the needs of that time and the needs of humanity at that time. So some of the new social laws brought by Baha'u'llah include the unity of people of all races, religions, and cultures. Now, actually, we believe that is a fundamental teaching of all of God's religions, but now is the time where we can actually implement this ideal of world unity. We have the means to do it through global communication, global travel. Okay, right now that's on hold with the pandemic, but we can truly create a global civilization now. We have the means to make it go from kind of a spiritual concept, an ideal, to reality. He also taught the elimination of all forms of prejudice, whether of race, of religion, gender. He taught explicitly the equality of women and men. However, Baha'is do believe that actually, as you've very, how shall I say? I was going to say ably pointed out, but that wasn't meant to be a reference to your name. But, in your wonderful book, we also believe actually this is the true meaning of the Quran as well, equality of women and men. The right to universal education, the importance of every single human being being educated and having a right to education. He taught about the imperative of eradicating extremes of wealth and poverty. That doesn't mean making everybody have the same amount of wealth, but it does mean we shouldn't have these terrible extremes we have today, where some people are destitute, do not have the basic necessities, while others live with great riches. And he talked about and taught about the need for the world's nations to come together to establish a system of peace and justice among them. So, there are many other teachings. He taught about the need for a world language that would supplement our own national languages so that we could communicate no matter what culture we come from, but at the same time respecting our native culture, right, our native language. So these are other teachings of Baha'u'llah. So that's a little bit about the life and teachings of Baha'u'llah. Now let me talk about the life of Abdul-Baha. So as I mentioned, Abdul-Baha was the eldest son of Baha'u'llah, whom Baha'u'llah appointed as the authorized interpreter of Baha'u'llah's teachings. So this was really critical, that Baha'u'llah was very clear about his successor, so that there was not the same kind of dispute that arose in other faiths about who would succeed the prophet after the death of the prophet. Now, there were some who rejected Abdul-Baha, but very small number, and the vast majority of Baha'is then followed Abdul-Baha. So Abdul-Baha also was distinguished by his caring nature, his generosity. Really, a special feature of his life is that he came to the United States of America in 1912. He had spent virtually his whole life in prison, and it was only as an older man, after the Young Turk Rebellion in the Ottoman Empire, that he was actually released from prison, from confinement, and was able to travel and leave the Holy Land. And he traveled to Europe, but he also made a trip to the United States in 1912, which is a fascinating story by itself. But what's really significant is he came to Lincoln, Nebraska. So, as Baha'is in Lincoln, like, we are so thrilled that Lincoln, Nebraska is an important part of Baha'i history. So here's a reproduction of the front page of the Lincoln Daily News, which talked about this Persian peace advocate coming to Lincoln. He stepped off the train, at the Haymarket there, the train station. And so, it's kind of fun. We have these articles where he gave interviews to the press in Lincoln. And among other things, he said here in Lincoln, the foundation of the world is one reality. And he said, all religions are one. And it's just the dogmas and doctrines that really are a perversion of the original teachings of religions, teachings of unity and of love for one another, that have caused enmity among followers of different faiths. So of course, in the Neighbors series, right, we've been trying to dispel a lot of those misconceptions about other faiths and find that common reality. Abdul-Baha revealed a prayer for William Jennings Bryan and his family in the guest book at the Bryan home. I don't know if you've seen that. It's attached to Bryan Hospital. It's called Fairview. And so actually a replica, or actually the original guest book in the Bryan home, is part of the collection of the Nebraska State Historical Museum. So in 2012, when we celebrated 100 years after Abdul-Baha's visit to Lincoln, the Nebraska Historical Museum had a special display about Abdul-Baha's visit. And the reason that Abdul-Baha really wanted to stop in Lincoln is that William Jennings Bryan was one of those Westerners who had heard about the Baha'i faith, become fascinated by this new religion that taught about the unity of religions, and really wanted to visit Abdul-Baha and on his world travels. So Mr. Bryan and his wife specifically stopped in the Holy Land to visit Abdul-Baha, and William Jennings Bryan wrote about his encounter with Abdul-Baha in ultimately a book he wrote about his world travels, but also it got published in the Chicago Tribune. While here in America, Abdul-Baha he really traveled from coast to coast along with Lincoln and spoke in synagogues and churches across the country, in New York, Washington, Chicago, Philadelphia, Denver, and other places. And we have a book, of the talks that he gave. One of the things he said in his talks is that the United States has a great spiritual destiny because of its potential to unify people of all different religions and backgrounds and races, its ideals of equality and human rights. But he said, in order to achieve that spiritual destiny, the United States would have to fix some big problems. One of them is materialism, the emphasis on material wealth, acquisition of things. And the other is racism. The Baha'i writings clearly announce the equality of people of all races and denounce racial inequality and injustice. And Abdul-Baha made it a point of not only meeting with some of the leaders of the nascent civil rights movement in the US, but of ensuring and insisting that all Baha'i gatherings be fully integrated, even if the laws were segregationist. And he spoke directly about the problem of slavery, of segregation in the United States in many talks. At a public meeting in Chicago, literally almost, what would that be, 9 years ago, April 30th, he revealed what's become known as the Prayer for America. This is one of the most revered prayers for Baha'is here in the United States. So I'm going to share with you this very short prayer. O thou kind Lord, this gathering is turning to thee. These hearts are radiant with thy love. These minds and spirits are exhilarated by the message of thy glad tidings. O God, let this American democracy become glorious in spiritual degrees, even as it has aspired to material degrees, and render this just government victorious. Confirm this revered nation to upraise the standard of the oneness of humanity, to promulgate the most great peace, to become thereby most glorious and praiseworthy among all the nations of the world. O God, this American nation is worthy of thy favors and is deserving of thy mercy. Make it precious and near to thee through thy bounty and bestowal. So this is, of course, as I said, a very special prayer. It's not actually saying that the US is superior to any other nation, except that if we do try to fulfill our ideals of equality and unity, right, then it's because of doing that we will become spiritually glorious. But of course, so will other nations, but nevertheless, we believe that the United States does have this special spiritual destiny and potential. Abdul-Baha died in 1921, so actually we're honoring this year the centenary of his passing. Very special year for us. About 10,000 people attended his funeral in the Holy Land, and leaders of diverse faiths mourned his passing. Not a single Baha'i actually spoke at his funeral. All of the orators were Muslims, Jews, and Christians, all of whom honored his devotion to the poor and the needy, and honored his example of selfless sacrifice for others. So since 1921, the Baha'i community has spread around the world. So obviously, Abdul-Baha's visit to America in 1912 sparked a lot of interest. There were already Baha'is here. First Baha'i in the US was actually beginning Baha'i in 1892, I believe. His name is Thornton Chase. But the faith quickly started to grow around the world and has become very diverse. And so a lot of African Americans were attracted to the explicit Baha'i teachings about racial equality. And so some well-known African American Baha'is include Elaine Locke, who founded the Harlem Renaissance and was a professor at Howard University in Washington. Dizzy Gillespie, if you're jazz fans, no doubt you know Dizzy. Dizzy was a Baha'i. Robert Hayden, a very distinguished American poet, and Elsie Austin, who's a well-known African-American civil rights advocate and lawyer. They were all Baha'is. So today there are about 5 million Baha'is residing in over 180 independent countries, representing over 2,000 ethnic groups. Like literally, Baha'is come from every culture in every country. It's kind of nice. Like if you're traveling, you can like look up local Baha'is, and it's like having a home anywhere you go. You know, Baha'is will be happy to open their home to you. So as I mentioned, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica Online, it is the second most widespread religion globally based on geographic representation. So in the few minutes that remain before we can turn to questions, I thought I would explain a little bit about the Baha'i administrative orders, we call it. So really uniquely among religions, Baha'u'llah brought, not only did he clearly designate his successor, Abdul-Baha, but he also brought a system of governance for his community involving the election of Baha'i assemblies. He calls them houses of justice at the national level and global level. So we have a body, and they each has 9 members, because 9 is that symbol of unity. And so at the global level, we have a body known as the Universal House of Justice, elected every 5 years. Within each nation, there's a national assembly that's elected every year. Each locality has a local assembly. We literally just had the elections for the Lincoln Assembly. They're part of our Rizwan Festival. So that's 9 Baha'is residing in Lincoln who help serve the Baha'i community. And then now we have regional ones. So there's a regional one for we call it the prairie states. So Nebraska, Iowa, etc. So it's an interesting system that relies on democracy, but at the same time, so we don't have clergy. There are no ministers, there are no priests. We have no clergy, because the idea is no one person spiritually has greater knowledge than another. We all can access God personally. But on the other hand, Baha'u'llah has brought some clear laws and teachings that as Baha'is we agreed to abide by. And if you're interested, I can share some of those. There aren't too many, but there are some important laws. So, by the way, that photograph is the Baha'i community in French Polynesia, where my family had a chance to serve about 15 years ago. And so that's their Baha'i Center, like that little open air hut that they built. But it's really remarkable. You know, they all are native Polynesians who accepted Baha'u'llah, and so we had a chance to live there for a few months and serve them. So a little bit about Baha'i community life. We don't really have churches. Some larger communities have Baha'i centers, but they're open to people of all faiths. So what we do, instead of getting together, you know, every week for a service at a mosque or a synagogue or a church, is we meet every 19 days. Of course, now it's on Zoom. And it's called a feast. Now, yes, we do have food, although it's not always like that kind of feast. But it's feast in the sense of an opportunity to get together, have fellowship, say prayers together, but also then to consult on the affairs of the community. So that happens every 19 days. In fact, we just had ours on Zoom, I guess. It seems like there's been an event every day this week. So anyway, that was just, I think, Tuesday. We have holy days that are open to everybody. Like I said, first day of Rizwan, 9th day, 12th day, which is Saturday. Those are open to everybody. We commemorate the birth of the Bab, the birth of Baha'u'llah. We commemorate their ascensions. So these are all important Baha'i holy days. I should mention we also have our own fasting period, which is during a particular Baha'i month of 19 days. I should mention we have our own calendar. Every religion has brought its own calendar. So in the Baha'i Faith, we have a calendar actually brought by the Bab, which divides the year into 19 months of 19 days in each month. So if you're a math whiz, you'll quickly figure out, wait a minute, that doesn't add up to 365, right? That's 361. So what about those extra 4 days? Well, those extra 4 days are called the intercalendar days, intercalary days we call them. But in Arabic, we call it Ayamiha. And that's actually our gift giving time. So that happens actually at the end of February. Then we go into 19 days of fasting. And the fast is very similar to Ramadan in the sense that we do not eat or drink from sunrise to sunset. Now, of course, there's a difference, which is that number one, the time of year is normally different. It's always in March for Baha'is. Also, it's only 19 days. In Islam, it follows the lunar calendar, right? So it's typically, if I'm not mistaken, 28 days. Is that about right? 28 to 30, yeah. And of course, Ramadan can also occur in the middle of the summer, right? When the heat is the worst. So, but there is that similarity of no food or drink between sunrise and sunset. So in terms of community activities, we're really engaged in trying to build unity at all levels of society, starting with our own neighborhoods. And we're also engaged in a process of education that helps everybody learn about the reality of human unity and to the importance of service to our communities. So we have what are called study circles, where we do study various books that include writings of Baha'u'llah and the Bab and Abdul-Baha, but they're open to everybody. Right now I'm doing some with, a student who's from China, and then another really good friend who's a former student who's from Iraq and actually who is Muslim, Kurdish and Muslim, Nasser. And so, we're studying some of these books with Nasser and others and his wife and others. We have devotional gatherings that are open to people of all faiths. You can share prayers from your faith, whatever it is, or even of no faith. So my wife and I are hosting those every week on Sundays on Zoom. And, we're trying to focus on the teachings of peace and racial unity. Those are the ones that we try to draw inspiration by reading Baha'i writings and other writings from other faiths on those topics. And then we have moral education classes for children and junior youth. And there's a special program for junior youth, about ages 12 to 14, that really focuses on developing an ethic of service to their communities and service projects. And again, this is non-denominational in the sense that actually that junior youth program is the books that they get inspiration from, have quotes from different religions, and it's not Baha'i focused. It's really aimed at developing an ethic of service to all humanity. And Baha'is are engaged in economic development projects and social development projects around the world in different localities. These are just a few examples. They involve promotion of literacy, education, advancement of women, improvement of the environment, expansion of healthcare, education and agricultural techniques, arts and media, radio stations. There are really thousands and thousands of Baha'i-inspired, I will say, development projects around the world. And of course, in keeping with this key principle of religious unity, Baha'is collaborate with people of all faiths to work towards peace and unity and love and among all people. We collaborate on commemorations of Human Rights Day, International Day of Peace, Martin Luther King Day, World Religion Day, the Lincoln Interfaith Prayer Breakfast. I recorded a Baha'i prayer for that. And we've been very active with issues of racial justice, including particularly collaborating on Race Amity Day, which is coming up on Zoom towards the end of May. So again, we try to collaborate with our brothers and sisters of all religions to promote peace and unity. So that's my introduction of what everyone should know about the Baha'i Faith. And here's some websites if you want further information. I know we're almost at 5 o'clock. Hopefully that's okay. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the very informative presentation. Personally, I've learned a lot, and I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure our audience, they have a lot of questions as well. Thank you so much one more time for joining us. I'm gonna just pause the recording now for students to be more comfortable asking their questions. Thank you so much, Professor Brian Leopard. I'm so happy we're ending this series with your presentations on your presentation on the Baha'i faith. A lot of what you mentioned like fits the core of the mission of doing all this talk series. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.